Hello again, everybody. Now I'm going to be covering exercise 15 in your training manual level 1. And this exercise is called Practice Using Distance and Angle Constraint Entry. We're basically going to be drawing an arrow, first in 2D and then in 3D. And then we're going to play with deformation command. So to start the model, we don't necessarily have an auxiliary model associated with this exercise. However, we will be using the template for small objects, millimeters. Once you have that template open, we're ready to begin. And keep in mind, since the arrow is symmetrical, we're only going to need to draw the lower half of the model. Draw the arrow with a polyline using a combination of absolute coordinates, relative coordinates, polar coordinates, and distant constraint. So we're going to begin by entering some absolute coordinates. So go to curve, polyline, polyline. For the start of polyline, type -11, 0, and then press enter on your keyboard. The next thing we're going to input into the command bar are going to be relative coordinates. So in this instance, type in R, -2, -2, and then press enter on your keyboard. Now we're going to practice using distance constraint. So for the next point, type 8 and press enter. Turn ortho on if it isn't already, and then pick a point to the right, and you can finalize the selection by clicking one time with the left mouse button. Now you're ready to move on to the next point, which is going to be relative coordinates. In this instance, it's going to be R, 1, 1, enter. Okay, moving along. The next input we're going to put in the command bar is going to be relative polar coordinates, which are going to be R, 11, left pointing arrow, 0, which implies 0 degrees, and then press enter on your keyboard. For the next point, type 1 and press enter. Turn ortho on and then pick a point downwards like so. And then click one time with the left mouse button to finalize the placement. And then for the next and final point, type in R6, 2 and then press enter. Now to finish this arrowhead, well, the half of the arrow, click one time with the right mouse button and you're done. So you should have an arrow that looks like this. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and mirror the bottom half of this arrow to complete the full arrow. So go ahead and click on it to select it. And then in your command bar, type in the command mirror, making sure that your settings, parameter settings for the command match mine. In other words, make sure it says copy equals yes, and begin your mirror plane. And the start of the mirror plane, type 0 and press enter. And then pick a point to the right. Be careful that it's oriented in the correct direction and not like this, which would be an incorrect mirror. Make sure you orient it to the correct direction and then click one time with the left mouse button to finalize the command. Now, before we move on, I'm going to add an extra command that will be helpful for the purposes of, not only this exercise, but any model you might be creating within Rhino, so that it doesn't accidentally come apart or you accidentally move a piece out of the way like I just did. A command that I would highly recommend that you use is called join. So make a window selection to select anything you would like to join together, and then in the command bar type in join and then press enter on your keyboard. And now when I click on either half of the arrow, the entire arrow is selected because it no longer exists as two polylines. It is now one complete closed polyline. So once you have joined the arrow, go ahead and select it one more time. And we're going to create a copy of this arrow. So type in copy in your command bar. The first thing it wants to know is point to copy from. I'm just going to pick a point, doesn't really matter where. And then I'm going to drag. I'm not necessarily clicking on the mouse. I'm just moving, the arrow upwards, and I'm just going to place the copy. There we go. Now, this is the part of the exercise where we actually transition from working specifically in 2 dimensions to moving on to 3 dimensions. However, this is the perfect time to advise everyone that it's very important that you work with all 4 of your viewports, if not constantly, at least at regular intervals, so that you can see precisely what is going on in the 3 dimensions. Because sometimes if you're limiting yourselves to just drawing in the top viewport, you really don't get a good sense of what's happening in the 3rd dimension in your perspective viewport. So at least take the time to check, right? If not, work consistently with your multiple viewports open. Okay, so now we're ready to move on to the 3rd dimension. So go ahead and click on the downward arrow down here. And what we're going to do is extrude it. And since we already know the name of that command, I can just go ahead and type extrude CRV. CRV is how Rhino abbreviates curve, right? So extrude curve, press enter, and then for the extrusion distance, mine is already set to 1. If that's not the case for you, just type in the number 1 directly from here in the command bar and then press enter. And that finalizes your command. Now we're going to go through an alternative way to make this arrow 3-dimensional. And first, we're going to kind of revert back to just half of the arrow, because that's all we really need for all intents and purposes for this next part of the exercise. So I'm also simultaneously going to introduce you to another command that works hand in hand with join. And however, I would like to caution you to be careful in the usage of the explode command, particularly when working with poly surfaces that have many different faces, because it will explode a poly surface into all of its individual, surface faces. So be careful if that's not your intent. Again, be very selective of how and when you use the explode command. Okay, so moving on, I'm going to select the arrow and type in explode in the command bar. The reason I did that is because, like I previously said, I only need half of the arrowhead, so I needed to revert it back to its individual pieces to be able to delete certain pieces and keep, in other words, preserve other individual lines in this half of the arrowhead. So now that I've exploded this complete arrowhead, now I can make a window selection and shift to select the half I want to get rid of, and then I can hit delete on my keyboard. And now it's still very much in a quote-unquote exploded state. So, you know, for convenience purposes, so that I don't accidentally move these lines around and create unwanted gaps within this polyline, I'm going to join those line segments. Okay, now I'm officially ready to move on to the alternative method to creating a three-dimensional arrow from a polyline. So what I'm going to do is revolve. And again, I already know the name of this command, so I'm going to type it into the command bar. However, if you don't remember the name, or if you prefer an alternative method to prompting this command, you can go to the top menu bar under Surface, and from there you can also select Revolve. For the start of the revolve axis, select the end of the polyline. Oh, sorry. First, select the curves to revolve. Okay. Press Enter when done. The start of the revolve axis, right, for that particular part of the command, select the end of the polyline. And then for the end of the revolve axis, select the other end of the polyline. Now the command bar has changed. Now it wants to know the start angle. So right there, go ahead and press Enter to use the default start angle. And then press Enter when the command bar changes to revolution angle to use the default revolution angle. And that is the alternative way to make the arrow 3D. Again, this was created using the Extrude Curve command, and this arrow, both of them 3D, was created using the Revolve command. And one more thing I'm going to discuss in this exercise is deforming a shape, particularly this one here, the revolved arrow. So go ahead and select the 3D arrow, and then from the Transform menu, click Bend. For the start of spine, click the end point on the left end of the arrow, like so. For the end of spine, click the end point on the right end of the arrow. And for the point to bend through, drag the cursor down and pick a point. And notice there's a lot of kind of give here. There we go. And finalize the placement with one left click. And that's basically how you deform a 3D shape using the Bend command. Okay, and that concludes exercise 15.